This podcast is created for farmers and powered by Pioneer Agronomy to bring you agronomic insights and proven solutions to fuel forward-thinking farming.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Brian Shrader, agronomist on the east side of the state, joined by my partner in crime and fellow co-host Ben Jacob, agronomist from southern Indiana. Hello, Ben. How are you?
I'm doing well, Brian. As we're recording this one a little bit out of cycle for us, by the time this comes out and folks are listening to it, I think we're going to be in a much different weather pattern. Today, though, is the heat wave of the week, and I think we came in at 23 degrees with full sun, so it's balmy out there. But by the time this airs, I think we'll have brushed up against 60 down here.
That's right. I walked out to get something out of my truck and didn't even put my coat on today. So that was a nice change of pace from waking up and getting going the other day at 9 degrees and 11 degrees and 12 degrees. So we're in a similar spot to you today as you and I are sitting here right now. The temperature in Upland, Indiana is 27 degrees Fahrenheit. So warmest day of the week by far. And as you mentioned, full sun. So it feels nice, even as long as you're out of the wind. It is starting to blow up here a little bit today, but it's still much better than it was on Monday or Tuesday for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, well, Ben, you and I and our fellow agronomist across Pioneer are in the midst of meeting season. And so there's a good chance that we've talked to a lot of customers the last several weeks, but I also know that we spend a lot of time preparing for those. And you've had a topic that has come up several times that you have started to, maybe we could say, go down the rabbit hole a little bit on, and that would be the relationship of nitrogen to sulfur. And I thought that today we'd just visit a little bit about that, talk about some things. As you and I were talking to warm up the podcast here, get started, we talked this little bit about the fact that we just simply do not have as much sulfur as we once did, as the government's required factories and other folks to clean up their emissions. We've lost sulfur, so we don't get what was traditionally thought of as acid rain to deposit that sulfur somewhat naturally, if you will, kind of a free nutrient for us. And so, over the last several years, we've spent a lot of time talking to folks about adding sulfur. And it's probably not whether I need to add sulfur at this point. It's how much and when and, in what particular product I need to add it and things like that. And so maybe to get started, tell us the conversations you were having that kind of started you on this path to think about nitrogen and sulfur and their relationship to each other.
Yeah, so there's a couple of tracks that kind of got me to where I'm at. We could go back probably a year ago, and reading an article from David Hula, of all people, and where he's giving what I assume are estimates of his total applied nutrient. And one of them that caught my eye was that the ratio of nitrogen to sulfur was a little bit different than what we're hitting out in the field. We may be typically, if we apply, in that 10 to 1, 14 to 1, and I believe he was closer to 7 to 1. So a lot more sulfur per unit of nitrogen out there.
Sure.
And so there's not a ton of research on sulfur rate, especially in corn. But what I did find is some research in some small grains, particularly in Europe, where they have the weather and the climate to grow much better small grains than we do here in Indiana. I mean, you're talking about the potential. I think the record wheat yield coming out of the UK was like 230 some bushels a couple of years ago. So, phenomenal yields, but their nitrogen sulfur ratios are much lower. Some of them, we're still seeing a yield response to bumping that down as low as 4 to 1, which is
that's a big change. You're 14 to 1. That would be a pretty common number, I would guess, for a lot of producers.
Yeah, and I would agree. So, and that's an insane amount of sulfur, and I'm not suggesting that we get down there, but I am suggesting that maybe we don't understand as well the need for sulfur and how much, because we always have had such a large supply of it for free in the soil. And much like nitrogen, a soil test is a very poor estimate of what you have available. And I mean, that compounds even further by, what is the availability and when is it available during the season, depending on what you applied. So I think, there's a couple of questions that stand out in my mind that I try to answer is how much sulfur do we really need? And there's some tissue samples that would suggest one thing or another, but I think more in the practical context of applied sulfur, how many pounds of sulfur is ideal for growing, say, a 250 bushel corn crop or a 280, but whatever your number is. We know that we need to apply some. Just how much do we need to apply, and then when does it need to go out, and what else do you get as pull through on that? So pushing this a little bit farther this summer, we did get the folks down at Rosedale, Michael Wagler, who, if you go way back on this podcast, has been on before, to set up a little trial for us. And we had a number of treatment strips, but we did pull tissue samples on 2 of them. And this kind of, I can't say that it was a surprise. And we kicked this off. You talked about the nitrogen to sulfur relationship. And I think there's a lot more nutrient interaction than probably what we're given credit to. I mean, we've talked before about the zinc and phosphorus relation. But what we saw, again, in one location, so take this for what it's worth, but it was a pretty sharp contrast that at the same nitrogen rate, 210 pounds of actual nitrogen, 2 strips side by side. One of them we had zinc and boron added. And the other one, we had just 15 pounds of sulfur added, which based on those ratios is pretty light, right? That's a pretty light sulfur rate. And so we had tissue samples on those at Tassel, and we saw the sulfur treatment compared to the zinc and boron treatment had really not that much more sulfur making it into the plant, at least as a percent of dry matter, the way that's measured, but saw a significant increase in nitrogen into the plant, a pretty significant increase in phosphorus. But the ironic ones were that where we'd applied that boron and zinc was actually significantly lower tissue levels than what there was in the sulfur treatment alone. So, I think that as we're looking at the current state of the ag economy, there's probably a lot of areas that we can get a lot more efficient if we understand better under the role that mineral nutrients are playing in the plant and how they're interacting with each other. And Bob Nielsen did some work years ago, and there's been several other folks that have shown the same thing, that under very high nitrogen rates you can see sulfur deficiency systems, right? So it's obvious there's an interaction there. But with some winter meeting prep, we've had some questions about it, and so I've kind of went down a whole rabbit hole. I would say that I'm often a better researcher than I am a presenter. So I have a hard time, folks that have seen me talk probably understand this, that I have a hard time just not sharing every fact that I think is interesting and boiling it down to the actual point. So maybe today we'll try and hit on a few key points without going too far down the rabbit hole. But the amount that I've read this winter about sulfur and nitrogen and other nutrients and their interactions in crops outside of corn and soybeans, because that's predominantly where the research is probably more than anybody ever wants to know. But I do think it's an area that we should focus on going forward and really, really try to refine, understanding that the weather has such a huge impact on what's going to happen to that out in the field.
Yeah. So maybe the best place to start with, folks, we've talked about nitrogen for years, and we can review this, but in terms of sulfur, what does sulfur do in the plant, Ben? Why is sulfur so important? We've always gotten it. It's always been part of the nutrients that are there, or up until the last many years, we had plenty of sulfur, so it was an afterthought. Very few folks put sulfur on maybe alfalfa occasionally, but beyond alfalfa, why is sulfur so important for corn producers to consider when they're looking at their fertility program?
Yeah, so sulfur obviously was the 4th plant essential nutrient kind of defined, and it is a macronutrient. As such, we need a relatively large volume of it, although it is a secondary. So at a lower rate than NP and K, but essentially without sulfur, I think the number one for me is without sulfur, you don't make protein because sulfur is a component of amino acids and therefore essential to building proteins, as amino acids make proteins, right? But perhaps a more important thing is it's a component of nitrate reductase, which means that you have to have sulfur along with several other nutrients. But for the context of this conversation, let's stick to sulfur. You have to have sulfur to convert nitrate to organic nitrogen that the plant can use, right? So it's critical. There's some other interactions potentially going on in nitrogen transport, but those are a little. Let me say they're a little less clear. There's just some suggestions. I haven't seen real firm evidence, and I think you may be getting the way I'm reading and interpreting that they may be muddying some facts with the real physiological benefits and trying to reach for some things there. So potentially just throwing it out there that may be something that exists, but I'm kind of lukewarm on that. But I would offer a point of conjecture here based on the tissue sampling that whether it's pull through from just having a healthier plant or there's an actual interaction or a play of how these mineral nutrients are transformed and used once they're in the plant, there does appear to be adding sulfur does appear to be a pull through on most nutrients. Right. I mean, I gave the example of what we tissue sampled, but you can scan through the literature and find many, many examples of getting just higher overall nutrient concentration as a response to sulfur. And so I think that I'd frame this as you're thinking about management implications. We're using sulfur as kind of a model element here because there's some information available on it. But I would look at this as across all the essential nutrients of plant nutrition that, and it really goes back. It's not a shock. I mean, we've all seen Liebig's law of the minimum, right? With the barrel staves, right? Yep. But I think it's a little bit different way of thinking of it. So, I mean, Brian, you would have been around, I can't remember, 16, 17, 18. Right around the time I started as an agronomist when the agronomy team was doing a bunch of sulfur work. And, yep. Those trials at the time, that was just really to find out, hey, do we need sulfur? Yes or no, right? Am I recalling that right?
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. That was what we were doing. I mean, basically that treatment, as I recall, in most cases was 100 pounds of ammonium sulfate applied before the crop. We looked at it in corn. We looked at it in soybeans. And basically for us, a win was a positive yield response. That was really what it was, because that was, just right around that time, 15, 16, 17 was where there was some realization that the deposition rates nationally were going down, I think, really quicker than what folks realized up to that point. You had some research, both Sean Castile at Purdue and some other folks that were looking at some things and saying, man, I think that there's a response here to sulfur. And we just went out to the countryside, asked customers and farmers to consider putting on, in my case, it was 100 pounds of ammonium sulfate. I was targeting more soybean acres than corn bin at the time, probably, partially just because of the geography. But yeah, we were looking at that, and again, a positive yield response was really all that we were looking for. We didn't, economics were a bit different, so it really wasn't a situation where we were looking at rates or anything like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, I mean, I think that's interesting that you apply 100 pounds of AMS and that gets you, what, 24 actual pounds of sulfur, I believe.
Yep.
And,
close to it. Yep.
So you're somewhere probably in that 10-to-1 ratio with that. If you were doing it in corn, which is pretty close. Like I said, I think some of it's probably a little bit lower. But I think the other question that's been coming up is, what do I apply? When do I apply it? And, what do I apply it with? And I think where I'm getting to is that even if that ratio is 10-1, I think maybe 8-1 might make more sense. But I'm to the point where if you have the option and you're putting nitrogen out, you probably better pair it with sulfur if you can do
Sure.
that. And
Yeah.
the reason I say that, I kind of beat around the bush about the actual increase in efficiency a minute ago, but there are some interesting grassland studies. Now I understand it's not corn, but it still is a grass, and it still is the same photosynthetic pathways. You're not necessarily delivering everything to a giant sink like you are in corn. So physiologically there are some differences, but this was actually monitoring the groundwater, the nitrate proportion of the groundwater under different fertilization treatments and pasture land. And so what they saw was between a 40 and 72% reduction in nitrate leaching into the groundwater. Now, where I said this gets a little messy is because on the other side of it, as they're tissue sampling, they only saw a 15% improvement in nitrogen recovery. And I say only, I mean, think about your nitrogen budget. If you're
Right.
gaining 15% on that, that's a significant amount. But there's a big noise between 72% reducing losses by 72% and recovery by 15%, right?
Yeah.
And it isn't grassland, it's not. But maybe there is something there. Maybe there is something there to that. But let's just assume that's true. That's where I think, okay, let's make sure that we have those two paired together. If there is something that's improving uptake, which again, sources are somewhat mixed on that, but if that's there, let's pair them together so we're getting more into the plant. Either that, or we have a better ratio in the plant, the right balance of nitrogen and sulfur in the plant for all the plant mechanisms that require both of them to function optimally as we go throughout the growing season. So, you mentioned AMS, right, in your trials. It might be worth hitting, and I know you probably have quite a bit of experience with this as well. Like, the source is as important as anything. So, as you have conversations with folks on what to put out, I know there's so much variability in what people can do and what's available. But what's your recommendation?
Yeah, my two recommendations, Ben, personally, I like AMS, especially if we identify, and your point, and I think maybe worth coming back to, is that soil testing is notoriously poor for really giving us a good estimate of what sulfur is. I will add to that if your pH is not spot on, you're going to have a very inaccurate understanding of how much sulfur you actually have available. Sulfur, the pH range for sulfur availability is fairly tight compared to a lot of the other nutrients. And so having a pretty squared away pH in the soil in your fields is going to be imperative for being able to utilize sulfur well. So with that said, I really take two approaches personally, Ben. The ammonium sulfate has always worked. It's typically fairly good. And for folks that realize and understand that they're either deficient or on the verge of crossing that critical level line, ammonium sulfate is an easy way to do that. I recommend spreading that before I go to the field in the spring and then basically planting. Now, that's the first step in my mind. The second step that I come back to, and I do this purely again because of economics, is that I will oftentimes recommend elemental sulfur in the potash application in the fall. Now, the big thing with that, and studies vary a little bit, but just like the nitrogen cycle and the sulfur cycle are very similar when you get to looking at them. And so you have to mineralize that elemental sulfur, and the chances of having, I would argue, maybe much more than half of that available the following year is probably about what you should bank on is 50%. So you're going to have to apply, in my estimation, and this is my recommendation, apply that ammonium sulfate application just before planting, probably for a couple years at least, maybe more than that, and then add in the elemental sulfur in the fall or whenever you do your potash application. And then over time, you could potentially wean yourself off of that ammonium sulfate application because you will have soil test levels that's the wrong way to say that, Ben, because of what we talked about with the inaccuracy. You will have enough sulfur in the soil, I guess is what I would say, to be able to provide the level of sulfur that you need to feed the crop. And so that's at least the approach that I take. There are other products. I know there's a lot of folks talking about some other products. I'm not as familiar with some of those other ones. A lot of those have come out of the specialty markets, I guess I would say. But I'm a bit of an old school fertility guy here. And so ammonium sulfate and elemental sulfur have been my two go-to recommendations.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I think that the elemental sulfur piece, there's so many things you have to consider. And I think, I missed doing it earlier, but maybe we should preface this trying to build sulfur or trying to manage it in the soil with your soil's ability to hold sulfur is directly influenced and controlled by the amount of organic matter that you have in your soil.
Yeah.
So we in Indiana are not as blessed, at least not our parts of Indiana, Brian.
Right,
not
exactly.
As some other parts of the world. So we're going to have a very limited ability to hold and then later mineralize and release sulfur into the growing crop. And so the other piece that comes into that is moisture and temperature affect the rate of mineralization. And breakdown of that elemental sulfur to make it available. So to your point, it's very unpredictable. Usually the estimate that I use, and again, there's such a wide range, but say the first availability is going to be 6 to 8 months after application. And that's assuming that you apply in the fall. And this year we've had a quote unquote real winter. I've taken some flack for describing it as a real winter, but it's the first time in several years where we've had a good solid freeze that's lasted a while. So that's quite the contrast to last year when we barely got below freezing, and then we had some 70-degree days in February and then some 80-degree days in March, right? Obviously, we're going to move the needle on that quite a bit. So I agree completely with everything you said. The only other point that I would make is around thiosol, ammonium thiosulfate.
Yes.
Is I have quite a few growers that are running liquid, running 32 down here, and that's a great option. ATS to add to your liquid application. I really like spiking if you're running any nitrogen in your starter and your 2x2, obviously not your pop-up, and your 2x2 if you're running spiking it a little bit with the ATS. But then if you're coming back to side drops, or if you're side dress, or if you're running wide drops, drop an ATS in there, and in that where we've been at is at 10 to 14 to 1, but I'm really leaning towards this year trying to push some of those, seeing if we can get it stripped out down in that 8 to 1 ratio, with every time we put liquid out having ATS in there as well. And that that gets you to a similar as far as sulfur content as ammonium sulfate, but a lower total nitrogen content.
Yeah.
So
Ben,
go ahead.
Maybe to clarify for folks, we're talking about ratios, and we're talking about, maybe 14 to 1 versus 8 to 1. We don't often talk about ratios, to your point, that there's more interaction there now. Maybe just for listeners that maybe aren't tracking with us completely, let's maybe clarify when we talk about this ratio of 8 to 1 versus 14 to 1, help folks understand what we're talking about when we're referencing that ratio.
Yeah. So let's just use, we'll make it simple. That is the actual pounds of nitrogen compared to the actual pounds of sulfur that you're applying. So, if you're applying your 100 pounds of ammonium sulfate, and I pulled it up here where we were talking, that's 24% sulfur. So you're getting 24 pounds of that. If you're putting out 240 pounds of nitrogen in any form, your ratio there would be 10-1 to make the math simple. And you could bump that actual pounds of sulfur up to 28. And so I think the long-term play of this is, if that ratio is important, and we do improve nitrogen use efficiency and we improve nitrogen uptake from the soil, the long term of this for me is that, yes, we might be adding more sulfur, but is there the potential to draw back the nitrogen rates? And does that help us? As I've mentioned before, in Indiana, we're pretty fortunate, but there are areas of the country, big watershed areas, where there is extreme pressure on the amount and the type of fertilizer you put out and how you document that. Is this a long-term stewardship play that doesn't negatively impact us as managers and producers? That we can stay ahead of some of the curve of things that are likely coming eventually. They go as the politics go. Sometimes they're more delayed than other times, but I feel pretty strongly that it will reach us eventually.
So I guess the next logical question, Ben, we've not hit on a rate. We've not given our listeners a number. And so my first question would be, should we just think about it in terms of ratio and let our nitrogen choice and decision dictate how much sulfur we're putting on? Or is there a sulfur number that a grower who says, I know I'm at that critical level, guys, or beyond, that I'm seeing sulfur deficiencies, is there a number I need to put on?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think the absolute bare minimum that you need to apply, and it's going to be so variable with what is in the soil and when you plant it and how quick your soil warms up and everything. But I think the absolute bare minimum is 20 actual pounds of sulfur. Or use your example, spread 100 pounds of AMS as close to planting as you can. And you'll get 24 pounds out of that. I think a more realistic number is probably 30 pounds. But understand that, again, the economics behind that, and the drawback to AMS is that you mentioned sulfate is highly leachable, right? And so it's kind of its own application in many instances. You want to have your potash out earlier than that. You want to have the AMS out as close to planting as you can. And 100 pounds of AMS is not going to be fun to spread for your fertilizer guy either.
Right.
So
there's
a balance, but that's the number that I would settle on. And then I would also take into account risk. I think that 30 number, if you are using AMS, is probably more realistic. The problem with using ratios is there's so much range on how much actual nitrogen is going out. And there's so many differences in the systems too, whether if you go out pre-plant anhydrous, your overall nitrogen rate's probably going to be higher in a lot of cases. And so one could argue that your overall sulfur rate probably needs to be higher to balance that out. So, you could look at it from a ratio that way, but there's also, if we're trying to be more efficient, in a lot of cases, I hate to admit it, but the thought process around nitrogen rate is let's just make sure we're not running out.
Right.
More than enough is the only way to have enough. So, I think that we want to try and move away from that as much as we can. Maybe this is a way to do that, to draw some nitrogen rates back to where they're more reasonable. But so I could go either way. Honestly, I think that, trying to get up to that 30 pounds of nitrogen in a corn crop. And when I say that, I'm talking 240 bushel and up. If we're down in a lot of my areas where 180 is a real good year, we can adjust down from there. But you're adjusting the nitrogen rate at the same time. But I really, in my mind right now, I'm looking at that 8-to-1 ratio as being what I'm going to shoot as we're trying to get some trials out this year. So we'll see. I think that it's an area that needs a lot of research still, like especially in corn and soybeans. But I'm also reminded that, Sean Castile, you mentioned, I haven't listened to him speak this winter, but last winter, in the winter before, I believe he talked quite a bit about how he was finding some efficiencies with his fungicide application and a sulfur treatment, that his sulfur treated beans had a better fungicide response than those without sulfur, where he didn't necessarily see a sulfur response in the absence of the fungicide. So, there's an interesting thought exercise you could do there with that. But when you look at a fungicide as this is protecting yield, was that a situation where there was just more yield there to protect because the system was balanced better?
Yeah.
But yeah, so a lot still to learn. I'm not saying that everybody needs to go out and spread a whole bunch more sulfur. I am saying that 90% plus 95% of the acres, if you are not putting sulfur on them, you probably should consider it going forward. And I wouldn't look at it as an added expense. I would look at it as capturing more of what you're already spending, improving efficiency with your current nutrient spend.
Well, and I think you make a good point, kind of riffing off of what you mentioned about Sean's responses. We clearly know that a healthier plant in all respects will work through stress better. We have talked about on the podcast probably literally hundreds of times at this point, the idea of compounding stresses. Mm-hmm. I know that's a favorite topic for you and for I. And if you have sulfur out there and your plant is not sulfur deficient, it is only going to handle those stresses much better as we move into reproductive stages and through the remainder of the season, corn or soybeans. I will add to that, Ben, your comment about if you're not putting sulfur on, you really should. I will tell you over the last 5 years, I have seen far more sulfur deficiency in corn and soybean fields than I did the first, call it 15 years of my career. We just didn't see it. When I started in the late 90s, early 2000s in the ag business, I never saw sulfur. I never had it pointed out to me unless, maybe when we were in school, they induced it so that we could see what it was. But in the field, in the real world, you just didn't see it. And it's not uncommon for me, at least, to get a couple calls, especially when it's stressful, to my point, and I see that sulfur deficiency starting to creep in. And so I do think that there's probably some merit to the idea that if I've got sulfur on there and I'm not deficient, I'm protecting my plant. It's a healthier, more robust machine, and it's going to get through some of those stressful environments significantly better.
Yeah. And I think we'd be remiss too if I didn't call out that the other thing is we're pushing soybean yields higher and higher. Sulfur is a cofactor in soybean nodulation. So adequate sulfur availability in the soil means more and bigger nodules. And my personal feeling is that somewhere around 80 bushels, the nodulation typically is not enough to keep up with the bean's demand for nitrogen. So I think that, as I talk to growers, there's a lot of us that feel like we've kind of plateaued in that 75 to 80 bushel range. And that might be a piece where we're holding back, that if we could improve nodulation just a little bit, that it would help a great deal. In addition to all the other benefits of sulfur and nitrogen being in adequate levels together that, we've already discussed in the context of corn, those would apply pretty much exactly the same to soybeans as well.
For sure. Yeah. And well, I guess we'll finish here. Maybe just, we talked about Liebig's law of the minimum, the barrel staves. The bottom line is you could fertilize till the cows come home with sulfur. And if you don't have the rest of your fertility and your plant nutrition dialed in, you're not going to yield at all. Sulfur's not a silver bullet for those folks that are not putting it on at this point at all. It's just part of getting much more accurate and more precise with our overall fertility program. So,
yep, absolutely. That's a great call out. And I often forget to make those caveats, but yeah, if you think of it as building a house or building a pyramid, if you don't have the building blocks in place, there's a reason that sulfur was the fourth essential nutrient, because
that's right.
You better have the other three.
That's right.
Three in order. Yeah.
Yep, for sure. Well, we appreciate everybody joining us today for our, journey down the rabbit hole on nitrogen and sulfur, maybe a little bit more sulfur than nitrogen. Ben, if somebody's got a question or they want to reach out to you about something they heard on the podcast, how could they get a hold of you?
Yeah, you can find me on X at the Ben Jacob and on Facebook at Ben Jacob Agronomy. How about you, Brian?
Yep, you can find me on Instagram, B_K_Shrader, and reach out to us. Let us know how you like the podcast. If you do like it, please make sure you give a thumbs up or a 4-star review on whatever you're listening to. That helps us know that we're headed in the right direction. But we love to hear from you, and if you've got a topic that you'd like us to cover, we would sure love to do it for you. So with that, we'll call it a podcast. Thanks for joining us again on the Indiana Pioneer Agronomy Podcast.
Thank you for listening to this episode from the Pioneer Agronomy team. Be sure to visit pioneer.com/podcasts to access additional episodes and learn more about our extensive on-farm data and innovative digital tools that are fueling forward-thinking farming.